Good evening, everybody. You're very welcome to first in our series of Let's Talk Sheep webinars. Tonight, our focus is going to be around nutrition, housing, and some labour-saving tips we can apply at this stage of the season. So I'm joined by my two colleagues, Michael Gottstein and Damian Costello. Gentlemen, you're very welcome on.
Thanks, Ciaran.
Thanks, Ciaran.
Look, we're going to split tonight's talk between the two years. Look, it's a relevant topic at the moment. Probably winter came in a little bit earlier for many of us this year with the wet November. So certainly, hopefully, people can pick up a few tips from it. Michael, I think we're going to start with yourself. You're going to cover some aspects around nutrition and some of that planning around the housing.
Yep.
That's okay. I might just get you to maybe start sharing your screen. And David, look, we're going to come to you in the second half of it. Again, looking at some of the housing, some maybe practical tips for how we can leave life a little bit easier over the coming months.
Yep.
Time's ticking on. So Michael, we'll hand over to yourself and I'll join you again halfway through.
Thanks, Ciaran. Thanks for the introduction and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So look, I'm going to talk a little bit about mid-pregnancy nutrition and kind of maybe getting the sheep ready for the house. And Damian is going to follow on that kind of a team as well. So like kind of, I suppose, a little bit about what's happening on farms at the moment and over the next kind of month or so. So look, this is a kind of a picture of what kind of happens inside in the O. So most people, I think, on the call will be in this mid-pregnancy phase at this stage. Maybe some of the later lambing hill flocks will be in this starting to come into that, but by and large, where most of the ewes in the country are probably entering that mid-pregnancy phase, rams are out at this stage on most flocks. And really what's showing there is that there isn't an awful lot of requirement there for energy and protein at this time of the year, over and above, we'll say, what a dry ewe would need. And then I suppose, why do we have so many ewes losing body condition in mid-pregnancy? And that's one of the things that we would be tracking on the people that participate in the Better Farm program with us, where we're basically body condition scoring the ewes at mating time and again then at scanning time. And what we're seeing in by and large on most flocks, there's an increase in the number of thin ewes as we move from mating time to scanning time, and then further this improves generally as we approach lambing. So look at the thin ewes are what are the problem, and maintaining body condition is I suppose the important thing that people should be considering doing. And you could say, why is it so hard? I suppose they're not at a particular time in their cycle where they need a lot of nutrition. But what we are seeing, I suppose, is in this time of the year is grass is wet, it's lower in energy, and generally it starts running out. So it's in short supply. So we have short grass, we have wet grass, and we have lower energy grass. And that all basically leads, I suppose, to, in some cases, the ewes not being able to get enough to maintain themselves, and they burn off condition. And why is that a problem? So thin ewes are a problem because thin ewes at lambing time produce smaller lambs. They spend less time mothering their lambs. So ewes that are in poor body condition spend less time licking and bonding with their lambs. They produce less colostrum and lower quality colostrum. And then subsequently, they have lower milk yield because they depend on body condition in early lactation to mobilize reserves to help them to milk. And all those things basically lead to higher lamb mortalities, or what some people call black losses. So these are ewes going out to the field with lambs at foot, and then the lambs don't come in at weaning time. They've disappeared. They've died at some stage, and Mr. Fox has come along and carried them away or whatever. So, and then I suppose sometimes people say, okay, look, if we lose a bit in mid-pregnancy, sure, what harm, we'll put it back on in late pregnancy. And this line here down here where it says it is not possible to build body condition in late pregnancy. And what that basically is saying is that once your ewes get into that kind of late pregnancy, last kind of 2 months, no matter what we feed them, they're basically going to start putting it into the lamb. So by and large, in what happens is the more you feed at that stage, the bigger a lamb you want to get. You're not going to put body condition back on the ewe. So really, I suppose important is that we try and maintain body condition. So why does it reduce? I've talked a little bit about this. So I mean, the main one is lack of feed. So if we were to kind of maybe say, what are the kind of top 5 things that cause ewes to reduce in body condition? Lack of feed is the number one. Okay, it's energy in. Basically, and if the energy isn't there, they basically mobilize body reserves. Okay, lameness, a lot of lame sheep around the place. I think as sheep farmers, we're almost, you know, a little bit lameness blind. You know, we continuously have lame sheep. We have a wild scholar doing a bit of work on farms there. It's not uncommon for him to find 20% of the sheep on the flock lame. Okay, so generally lameness is a big enough issue, and this time of the year, I suppose, when things are muddy and all that, it can be quite difficult to keep on top of it. So that's an important one to get on top of it. Weather, obviously, okay, it's very, we've had very bad weather for the last number of weeks, a lot of wet and windy weather. You know, the sheep are kind of probably standing under ditches or even under trees more so than out grazing. You know, grass is very wet as well, lack of shelter, all those things obviously have an impact. Parasites. So the main parasites that we'll be looking at in adult sheep would be things like liver fluke, or external parasites like scab and lice. And then look at underlying health issues. So those will be some of the kind of long-term conditions like CLA, OPA, iones, those type of conditions. And we'd be hoping that most people would have pulled off them yos prior to to mating, so that we shouldn't have a big number of yos, I suppose, with underlying health issues that went to the ram and that are then subsequently reducing rapidly in body conditions. So look at the main one I'm going to focus on really is this kind of lack of feed, and maybe a little bit we'll talk a little bit about lameness as well, because I think that's probably the second biggest factor there. So look at, I suppose, in terms of what are the options to do at this particular stage, it's managing those thin yos, right? So like we can't probably put a whole pile of condition on them. That's not what we're looking to do. We're looking basically for them to stop them from losing weight. So thin yos, basically, what are the options? Bring them in early, give them, say, hay and silage, you know, plus a concentrate maybe if you have poor quality silage. If they're outdoors and there is grass, um, I suppose there's the option. If it's very good grass and there's lots of it, they might do fine on that. And if not, then maybe I suppose there's this idea maybe that we should give them a little bit of concentrate. But for those tin yos at this stage, I mean, feeding them, you know, a small little bit of meal if we don't have suitable grass or very good quality silage to put them on to help them to maintain body condition, maybe build a little bit. You know, feeding kind of 300 to 500 grams of a basic ration per day will cost somewhere between €5 and €8 a head. That's probably money well spent in terms of those yos subsequently being able to rear their lambs successfully. And look at, I suppose, no different to trying to fatten lambs. If we have lambs outside in this type of weather on grass, very hard to put condition on them, very hard to put weight on them. Generally, most people would say once you house those lambs, they turn inside out. It's the same with the yos. The yos are no different to the lambs. You house them, you know, in inclement weather conditions, then obviously they have shelter, they have more comfort, and it's easier for them to get their food. So the lameness one, this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine. I think, you know, sheep farmer goes out and sees a lame sheep. That's something I see every day. You know, suckler farmer goes out and sees a lame cow, brings the vet or the hoof fair and sorts it out. Okay, we obviously have a lot more sheep on farms than we have cows generally. But really, I suppose what we're seeing is that on most farms where we have good handling facilities, we have very few problems with lameness. And on farms where we have poor handling facilities, we have much higher incidences of lameness. And you know, so really, I suppose there's a very strong correlation between handling facilities and lameness. And by handling facilities, you know, in particular foot batting, I'm not talking about this little plastic tray here that some people might have inside in a race. You know, you could have 4 or 5 of them inside in a race. Your contact time is seconds, you know, walking the sheep through it. Met a farmer one time, he said, look, I'm walking it through it 3 or 4 times. It's still seconds. As opposed to a batch foot bat here. This is one in Gurteen Agricultural College. There's 75 lambs inside in that footbat. You can see there's a long race running down here. You know, sheep come out, they end up in here, and then they work their way through the footbat. Every time the sheep come into the handling unit in this situation, they're walked out through that particular footbat because it's big, because it's roofed. It's not that very expensive to fill it and keep it filled, and the lameness never gets a chance to get going in the flock in those situations. Okay, so really, I suppose the point I'm trying to make here is control the lameness before housing, because you know, once you put them into the house, obviously there's much closer contact. It spreads a lot easier. So there's a little bit of thinking, I suppose. You know, I have 2 weeks of grass left. Okay, we need to bring in the sheep. You know, pull off the lame ewes, treat them, get on top of the lameness before housing. No point in waiting a day or two before housing and then start foot batting the sheep and maybe pulling off a few lame ones and then having to house them with the sheep. because that with the rest of the sheep, that's not a solution. So really, I'd be advocating strongly that people would, a week or two before housing, pull off them lame sheep and treat them until they recover and delay housing them if you have to. And that's not to say that there's other sheep that aren't lame at the moment when they go into the house won't become lame, but at least if you're not housing sheep, I suppose, that are lame, you have a much better chance of staying on top of them once they go into the house. In terms of the feed management, and I suppose at this stage, whatever silage and hay you have, and whatever ration you're going to buy, that's what you're going to buy. But I suppose it's around how we manage that, and forage, like an awful lot of the diet and sheep's diet is going to be forage based. It's going to be either hay, haylage, or silage in most cases. And how can we make that better or improve the quality of it and the intake of it? And that's, I suppose, the first thing there, chopping. So if we chop it, it increases the intake. So the more finer it's chopped, the higher the intake is. So, precision chop silage is generally has a much higher intake capacity than really long bale silage. If you have chop bales, it's better. If you have a chopper, on the farm, then that obviously improves the intake as well. Access, can they reach the forage? And this is a big issue on a lot of farms. So here you can see sheep inside in a shed, a loose house. They've got a ring feeder with a bale inside in it. And at the moment, there's no problem with access. You can see here, look, there's lots of silage down around here that they can reach. Obviously, they've eaten in as far as they can reach. You have this area of the bale here in the middle, which looks a little bit like a kebab that you'd see in the kebab shop. They can see it, but they can't reach it. And I suppose it's important that once the silage here is eaten, that silage is knocked down so that they can reach it. And it's the same with linear barriers. So on these linear barriers here that you see in the background, if we were feeding silage there, or hay, when the sheep are nosing through it, sheep are selective grazers, so they select out the leafiest, more succulent silage or forage, and while they're doing that, they're pushing it away from themselves. And very often with linear barriers, what we can find is that, particularly with hay, which is very light and easy for them to nose away, that it can be hard enough to have access all the time because they're constantly pushing it away from themselves. Okay. So having access 24/7 is really important if we want to increase the intake. And the more silage and hay we can get them to eat, obviously, the less we have to go in with concentrates. Removing refusals is another one. So again, look, I mentioned it already, sheep are selective grazers. So they eat the leafiest, most succulent bits first, and they leave the stemmier stuff or the stuff that isn't that tasty after them. If we force them to eat it, they'll nose it around for as long as they can until they get really hungry, and then they'll eat it. Obviously, that reduces intake. If we remove that regularly and give them fresh stuff, obviously that increases the intake, and it also improves slightly the digestibility of the stuff we're giving them because we're taking away the stemmier and the non-palatable stuff. If we're feeding outdoors, protecting it from rain can help in terms of improving intake. So as you're not washing the water-soluble carbohydrate out of the roughage, it doesn't spoil as easily. Keeping it clean around it outdoors. If we were feeding with that type of feeder, you'd have a lot of mud here. Moving it regularly to prevent them from putting the mud up here on the forage, and then obviously not wanting to eat that. And then the last one, I suppose, that affects your feed management of the forages is the feeding frequency. So how often do we feed it out fresh? So do we put out bales every day? That's obviously very labor intensive. Do we do it twice a week or 3 times a week, or do we do it once a week? And obviously, the longer the silage is out there, the more exposed it's exposed to air and it's going off. So the more frequent we feed it, the better from an intake point of view. But I mean, there's a trade-off there, I suppose, in terms of the labor associated with that as well. A lot of people are working off farm, have part-time jobs and things like that. So it may be not possible to feed as often as you would like to. But certainly trying to find the right balance there between the type of silage you have, how stable it is, and that that they constantly have palatable silage or forage in front of them, and that way that you're maximizing your intake. In terms of truck space, and truck space is really important. And to be honest with you, I think I have yet to walk into a sheep shed that has enough truck space. Okay, truck space is a big issue, I suppose, in terms of allowing sheep to get their fill, in particular when we start feeding concentrates. Here we have a linear barrier system. So we've got a linear barrier up here and here. And what you can see when we're measuring it out, there's areas of the barrier that sheep can't eat out through. So for example, here, this little door, which is about 2 foot wide, this sheep here is obviously blocking any other sheep from coming in here. And look, we recommend kind of 500 to 600 mils per sheep. So 500 for your kind of 70, 75 kilo clean or lighter type yo, 600 mils for your heavier type, Suffolk Texel Cross yo, 85, 90 kilo type yo. And to be honest, a lot of farmers they say that's too much. And when you see 600 mils, 2 foot per ewe, there'll be lots of space there. In particular, when we house the sheep. But as the sheep get bigger, I suppose they fill up some of that space. And really, it's not that we want to have the sheep wedged in, absolutely wedged in. We want extra space because what's going to happen when we're feeding along a barrier here with our bucket running along there with the meal, after a minute or so, one of the ewes here is going to decide she's not happy with what's in front of her. She's going to back out, head down here somewhere and try and find a spot. And if there isn't a spot there, then you get that crush and that pushing and straining. The shy feeders are knocked out of the system, don't get their feed. It increases the risk of prolapse and things like that in later pregnancy. So look at the point I'm trying to make here is, if you need extra trocks, put them in. Don't be saying, it'll do, fire a few trocks in here. I know it means having to get into the pen with them to feed them, but it'll pay dividends in terms of reducing problems and making sure that those tinerios and shy feeders don't get pushed out of the way. Again, keep on top of the health issues. I've mentioned lameness. I think that's a big one inside in the house. Spreading lime along the barrier here twice weekly before bedding will help to keep on top of that as well. And then look at, as sheep become lame, take them out if you can, or at least at the very minimum, treat them promptly. Water is important. Sheep drink a lot of water, in particular if they're eating kind of haylage or hay, where they wouldn't be getting a lot of moisture from the forage. So, making sure that they have clean water when the ewes are eating here. They're going to, after eating, generally will go for a drink of water. They'll have a bit of meal on their puss. They might have a bit of silage when they're eating silage, or if it's freshly bedded, they'll be nosing around in the straw. And what you'll find over a period of days is there'll be accumulation of meal, silage, straw, and dung inside in the water troughs. So look, I think twice a week is probably a good idea to clean them out. For me, with the sheep, the only way I could ever think of doing that is pick 2 days in the week. Last job before you go in on a Monday and a Thursday, clean out the trucks or whatever days of the week people pick. But, at least then there's clean water available for the sheep. So look at, I suppose then, as we get closer to the lambing period, and I suppose we're a bit away from this, maybe except for early lambing, ewes are probably in this situation already when we start feeding meal. It's really important, I suppose, that we manage the nutrition in such a way to try and avoid metabolic diseases. And metabolic diseases are things like twin lamb disease, milk fever, prolapse as well. So it's how do we, and bloat, or not bloat, acidosis and things like that. So I suppose the real thing here, when we're introducing meal, generally you always know what meal is, so there's no need to train them to it. They'll see you coming with the bucket, and they'll remember that stuff was really good from last year, and they'll all come running. So introduce it gradually, small amount at the start, build it up gradually over a period of time. And then really important is that once we go over a half a kilo or a pound per head per day, and for those of you that are on the old money, we need to switch to twice a day feeding. And often people delay that and push that up to 0.7 or 0.8 because, it means having only to go to the shed once a day. And you're not having to go out in the morning as well. But that's a bad idea, and it really, really predisposes yours to things like prolapse, in particular in later pregnancy, because you get that little bit of subacidosis there that is preventing the forage then from being digested. Allow plenty of space. I've already mentioned that. And look at avoid rushing and forcing, and that's really important, in particular for people where they're feeding outside of the pen. So some people might be housing sheep inside a shed, a loose shed, and then have the trucks outside somewhere in the yard and are letting the sheep in and out. Really important that we've big wide gates, that we're not trying to get 50 or 80 ewes out through a 7-foot gate or something like that, that they're not going around sharp corners, and that when they do get out there, that there's lots of trucks space for them to find, and that they don't have that far to go. Really important as well, pre-lambing, I suppose, is to have CalMag in the ration. We're very good at putting CalMag into rations after lambing to prevent grass tetany, but that magnesium has an important role to play in terms of preventing things like milk fever and also helping muscle tone and things like that. And we think that there might be a link there between, putting CalMag in and reducing prolapse as well. So for that reason, I'd be saying CalMag in the ration, and for sheep that aren't getting ration, maybe hill sheep on a hill as they're coming down towards the low ground, to put out a few of them buckets onto the hill before you bring them onto the green ground, and then give them CalMag buckets on the green ground as well, might help to reduce the incidence of prolapse and some of those other issues that I already mentioned. In terms of the ration quality, this is a slide that many of you will have seen. It's a slide that's on the go for a good number of years. It's what we call our traffic light system. So green is for go. It's like the car. Orange, you're still going through it, but you're not that terribly happy about driving through it. And red, we stop. And basically what I've done here is rank the ingredients on an energy ranking basis. So the green, the ingredients in the green box are the highest in terms of energy. The orange box then are I suppose, they're still quite good ingredients, but they're just about 10% lower in energy density than the ones in the green box. And then the ones in the red are the poor, low quality ingredients. And a lot of these would have similar energy ratings to forages, to your silages and things like that. So you don't really want to have an awful lot of them inside the ration when you're paying, 300 or 350 euros a ton for it, because you have lots of silage at home. You don't need to be buying that in a bag. All right. So really what we want to see, I suppose, is most of the top 5 ingredients, most of the rations, your ingredients are going to be in descending order. So the top 5 generally make up most of the ration, and they really should be in the green, or predominantly the green box, high energy ingredients. And energy is really important. That's what we're looking for in the ration, more so than protein. Protein becomes really important, I suppose, in the last 2 or 3 weeks before lambing down. And at that stage, what we're looking for is soybean meal. Okay, soybean meal is the best form of protein that we can give to ewes in late pregnancy, because it's got what we call digestible undegradable protein, and that's protein that is digested not by the bugs in the rumen, but digested in the intestine, and that creates much better quality colostrum for us. So really, we'd be looking to have probably around 20% protein in the ration. If that's not there, you're buying a lower quality ration, maybe not with soybean meal high up in the ingredients, then that's fine. Run with that, but then just maybe buy a few bags of soybean meal and sprinkle it on top in late pregnancy, and that's a way to get around that particular issue. There is, I suppose, a trade-off between buying a high quality ration at a very high price versus a medium quality ration at a lower price, but feeding more of that medium quality ration. So there's a little bit of kind of maths to be done on this. If you're going out and you find the real Rolls-Royce ration, but it's 450 euros a ton or 480 euros a ton, and you can get a very good ration, but not as high quality, for maybe 350, and you could say to yourself, look, I feed 20% more of that or 15% more of it, it'll be as much energy that's in the high quality one, but it'll be a lot cheaper in my pocket, so there's a little bit of maths there. And anyone that wants to have a look at their rations, your local Teagasc advisor will be more than helpful there in terms of having a look at those and advising you on that. And then look at my last point, and I really can't labor that enough, is the whole area of feed management is probably as important as the feed quality. Okay, so you can feed the best quality silage and have the best ration, and if you don't manage it rightly, then it's just not going to work for you. And the converse is true. You can have moderate quality feed or silage or hay and a medium quality ration, and if you manage it properly, you get much better bang for your buck from it. So the whole area that I talked about there, feed management, in terms of removing refusals and all that, becomes very, very important in terms of driving intake. So look at a summary slide, Ciaran. I'm coming to the end. Most important job for people, I suppose, at this particular point in time is to hold body condition in your ewes. That is really an important job, I think, that people should consider. And if that means pulling off some of the lame ewes or the thin ewes and lame ewes and treating them, that's what needs to be done. Prepare the shed in good time so that when the sheep need to come in, it's all ready, that you're not rushing around trying to get pens ready and all that type of stuff. Have your penning sorted, your truck space worked out, your water supply working, water trucks cleaned out, things like eave chutes and all those kind of things in place so that there's no rainwater coming in. Manage your feed to maximize the intake and the feed value. I've already talked about that. And then feed a high quality concentrate at the right level and the right time. And lastly, to eliminate any health issues that are going to compromise the ewes and, take away from what you're trying to achieve. And hopefully, hopefully this time next January, February, March, whenever you're lambing, this is what you'll be looking at, a couple of days in, pin of yours with nice healthy lambs, all going well and getting ready to head out to grass there. So that's me, Ciaran.
That's great, Michael. Thanks. Good comprehensive overview there of some of the things you need to pay attention at the moment. I might just let you catch your breath there for a moment. And Damian, I might get you to start sharing. Look, for those attending tonight, we have the Q&A tab is at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions for Michael or Damian as he goes through his slides, by all means, put them in that Q&A tab and I'll ask them at the tail end of it. Michael, just when Damian's getting ready there, like, well, it's probably arguable we overlook a little bit of what happens in mid-pregnancy. We put in huge efforts in getting our yolks ready to go to the ram, getting that condition score right. Taking our eye off the ball at the moment, particularly in a wet year, we can quickly melt condition off yolks.
Yeah. It doesn't take a lot, and I mean often it's just the case that we're running out of grass there, and like we'll move them at the weekend, or we'll house them next weekend, or something like that, and it's that delay that absolutely melts the condition off them, and I suppose what my advice is, if you find yourself in that situation that you can't move them for whatever reason, fire out a bale, to them, or supplement them in some shape or form, because the last thing we want to do is to knock the condition off. And what we've seen, and from the Better Farm program, where we have a technician going out, basically body condition scoring yours, is that even with very good management and a lot of flocks, the number is increasing, and I suppose the flip side of that is if we don't have good management around that, you could have an awful lot of thin yolks. And what 2024 showed us, Ciaran, and 2023, is that those thin yolks in the bad springs, they really suffered. This spring gone by was a really good spring. And look, at thin yolks managed fine because the weather was good, the grass was good, everything came right. But go back to 2024 and 2023 before it, where we had flocks with high proportions of thin yolks. We had huge problems in terms of lamb, those black glosses out in the field. And that was just because they had enough body condition.
And I think, Michael, like based on previous winters we've seen, wet years we tend to see more of that condition score loss. Sheep seem to be fairly tolerant of good cold winters, but not wet conditions. It's limited intake more. We tend to burn off a bit more condition in the like of the weather we had there in November.
Absolutely, wet grass. I think UCD looked at some of this stuff. Wet grass reduces intake by 20%. Short grass reduces it by 20%. You have wet short grass, you have a double whammy, you have a lot of rain on top of it. You're always trying to keep warm. It's absolutely zapping the energy out of them, at that particular point in time. Yeah.
Okay, look, we'll give you a few minutes off. You can sit back and enjoy Damian's talk. Damian, I think you're ready to go. You have to point that up. We'll hand over to you at this point. Again, look, I just like to remind everybody, you have the function there in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. If you have questions about what Mike or Damian are covering, by all means, put them in and we'll come back to you. Damian, I'll throw it over to you. I'll join you again when you're finished your talk.
Okay, thank you, Ciaran. You're seeing that first slide, okay?
Yeah, no, everything's coming through grand and we can hear you.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Ciaran. So good evening, everybody. And again, the focus of my presentation for the next 15 or 20 minutes or so is on, labour and how potential ways you can reduce labour during the housing period and right into the lambing period. I suppose following on from what Michael was talking about there, watching body condition, getting your nutrition and particularly your feeding management right, they're certainly big contributors to reduce labour at lambing time. So if you're finishing up at lambing time with as few ewes as possible, lambing down in suboptimal condition, then I suppose you're onto a winner in terms of less issues with thin ewes lambing down and that. I suppose just in terms of the outline of my presentation, I suppose I'm going to have a quick look at what to be considering, I suppose, in the run-up to housing. Some simple modifications to existing housing that can be a help, and good management practices, I suppose, to reduce labour around the winter housing, or a few tips on that. And looking a little bit further ahead into the lambing period for most people, again, previous studies have shown us that up to 20 to 25% of the annual workload with the sheep flock can take place in and around the lambing time. So that's substantial. And maybe looking at some small kind of doable investments that can save time around the lambing time, and looking at other tips and tricks around the period of housing and lambing that can be a help. I suppose when we look in terms of sheep housing, Michael mentioned some of this before in terms of the importance of feed space. And I suppose not to state the obvious, but that all ewes can eat comfortably, can eat concentrates at one time. That the shed is laid out in a way that one person can complete the feeding. Whether that means extra access points or feeding, dividing the pen so that they can be fed back and front or whatever it might be. And again, as Michael mentions, they need to have a constant access to forage. And if that's along a feed barrier, in the particular shed we're looking at there in the picture, I know the farmer in question farks some silage into the walk-through trucks after feeding the meal in the morning, so that there is a constant access to forage there. Again, they must have adequate lying space. As Michael already mentioned, a clean water supply is essential. Ventilation, again, from a health point of view, and also if you have a poorly ventilated shed, you'll spend a lot more time and money bedding the shed, because you're in a damp atmosphere, and it'll be harder to keep the straw bedding dry. And again, at this time of the year, prior to housing, making sure that any repairs on lights and power sockets and so on, chat to your electrician and get these things sorted well before you're housing your sheep. I suppose in terms of a checklist, I mean, lots of people, it's no harm to have a look and see how you're fixed in terms of floor space. The Department of Agriculture do have floor space requirements, minimum requirements for sheep housing or for housing of all animals. If your pens are overcrowded, it's going to be difficult to keep the bedding clean. There'll be bullying. Stronger sheep will be dominating the thing. And if you have thin ewes, as Michael mentioned earlier on, in a crowded pen, thin ewes will only get thinner. So having the infrastructure in place in the shed that you can separate out these thin ewes and give them a little bit of extra care. Just as an example there, for the large framed ewes that we mentioned, 85 to 90 kilogram ewes, if they're on straw bedding, 1.4 meters squared is their requirement. If they're on a slatted floor, 1.2 meters. So there's no harm to throw a tape on your pens and see how you're fixed for floor space. Very often floor space can be adequate, but it can be feed space that can be the limiting factor. And as we mentioned already, all ewes need to be able to eat meal together. And for the large frame ewe, you're talking, as Michael mentioned, 600 millimeters or 2 feet per head. And in the early part of the housing period, they made it look fine for space, but it's not any smaller. These ewes are going to be getting in the run up to lambing. So that is the target of the 600 meters. So again, no harm to measure out each pen and see how you're fixed for feed space. Many people ask the question, then what about I outwinter my sheep by and large, feed them in troughs. So again, 300 to 500 millimeters of trough space per ewe is required for outwintered, assuming they can feed from both sides of the trough. And again, Michael mentioned this earlier on, where you have where you're feeding concentrates on 2 sides of a pen, allow for the blanked off corner. There's probably about 600 or 900 millimeters there that is inaccessible from a feed space point of view. What are the kinds of, suppose, the small modifications? We're not going to start talking about totally redesigning the interior of your sheep house at this stage, but what are the potential small modifications that could still be carried out prior to housing? In terms of penning, we talk about feeding by litter size and by lambing date and by body condition score, separating out the thinner ewes and so on. Would a few extra pen divisions help in terms of dividing up the ewes better, and in terms of a more accurate feeding plan? I think they certainly could. Is there an option to provide additional feed space if you are, we'll say, dividing your extra pens? Could you be looking at something like this walk-through track this here, where you've 15, 20 feet of extra feed space, as well as what's along the front of the pen there? it could be as simple as a hang-on truck or just an extra truck in the pen that you can when all the other areas are covered, that you've kept a little bit of concentrates for 3 or 4 ewes to give them that extra bit of space. I mentioned, I suppose, about checking your lighting and sockets and so on, getting your electrician to have a look at that. Also, there's always little bits of repairs in terms of like these little access gates here, for example. Are the latches working properly? Is there any little bit of repairs or welding to be done? Check all those well in advance of housing. Again, I mentioned the importance of ventilation from a flock health point of view, keeping the air fresh. And also, I suppose, from a straw bedding point of view, if you have a poorly ventilated shed, if you'll have a difficulty, you'll have a damp atmosphere, and it'll be hard to keep the bedding clean. If you look at the underside of the roof, very often in any animal housing, if there's a lot of dust and that clinging onto the underside of the roof, it's a sign that ventilation is compromised, because there's condensation in the air and it's picking up dust particles on the underside of the roof. So, like, simple fixes like is removing some sheeting from an adjoining building going to help with the inflow of air into that building? Would raising some sheets on the roof provide more of an outlet for that air? Again, as I say, you're not going to do a big scale changing of the roof at this stage of the year, but there can be simple fixes that could be looked at to improve the ventilation situation. I suppose I maybe mentioned in the introduction that there will be some simple and cheap kind of labour saving, but I suppose it's only fair, I suppose, to mention that there are labour saving machinery available to people. Again, a sizable investment for anybody that's going down that route, but also a sizable saving in labour, and obviously depending on the scale of the sheep enterprise and the size of sheds, and also having feed passages and so on that are suitable for using this type of equipment. This particular piece of equipment here, it will unwind either silage or hay or straw bales. It's more often than not used for feeding silage or hay. And it will unwind the bale as you drive along the passage. Can be used to unwind a straw bale as well, but it won't blow it into a pen or that kind of thing. You have the other option then, obviously pricier equipment again, where you have it's a straw or silage chopper and blower. So this can be a dual purpose machine, as in it can be used to bed your it can be used to bed your straw bedded pens from the passageway, and also it can be used to feed out silage. It's probably necessary that you have some way of loading this, so you have a second vehicle, either a second tractor with a loader or some ways of loading this machine up. Again, as I say, this won't be for everybody, and let nobody go away saying, they said on the webinar tonight everybody needed to get a straw blower and a bale unwinder, but it may be an option, as I say, for larger flocks, and there can be labour saving. There can be labour saving in them. Some people, again, very much dependent on the farm and the area you're working in. Some people look at extending the grazing period or the outdoor period as part of reducing labour. In this situation where a forage crop is growing, to winter the ewes on maybe up until probably scanning time, or delaying housing maybe until January or late January. Again, there is a certain amount of labour involved in strip grazing these crops, and there's a certain bit of management in terms of providing a rough source and a run back and all that kind of thing. So, and again, the importance of being aware of the cross compliance rules in terms of grazing these forage crops. Others look outside the farm gate in terms of temporary grazing. Sometimes this can be available on cattle farms in the area, where they want to use a sheep flock to clean off. But again, the critical thing, I suppose, is it suitably fenced for sheep, and is there obviously water and so on provided. Again, important to for temporary grazing agreements that you check the National Sheep Identification System requirements in terms of the temporary movement of animals, and make sure you're in compliance with those. But again, it can delay the housing period, and is a potential to reduce labour there as well. I suppose look at it in terms of little tips and tricks in terms of general work practice. And again, look at a lot of the time, these might sound like really simple and kind of we know that already, but it's a combination of getting the small things right, I suppose, that kind of saves time in the long run. There's an old saying there, a place for everything and everything in its place, in terms of, I think you can apply this to the farm implements that you're using on a daily basis. And this is just a photo of I've taken from a shed in Donegal, where all the regularly used implements have a hanging place at the end of the sheep shed. So you're never spending your time walking around looking for a shovel or a fork or whatever you may be looking for. So other little tips, I suppose, in terms of where some or all sheep are outwintered, having maybe your half-ton meal bin in the field alongside the tracks, and maybe having your bags pre-filled for the week. Michael mentioned earlier about part-time farmers. If you fill up the number of bags you need for that group of sheep for the week, have them in your meal bin adjacent to the track. And before you get out to work in the morning, or before you get home or on your way home in the evening, you can pop in and feed them, and you're topping up your meal bin at the weekend. Again, for house sheep, I suppose it might sound like a small one, but the likes of these meal trolleys can be very handy for doing a number of different sheds. And what other people have something similar, where they fill their meal bags or meal buckets, we'll say, the evening before, and they're inside in this meal trolley, ready to go in the morning. So you're just literally going around to each of the pens and feeding accordingly. Michael mentioned earlier again the importance of good handling facilities, and I just included this photograph here. I suppose this is in a farm in County Galway, where this particular farm, he was only this year this batch footpath was constructed. You can see it in the photo, but his handling facilities are to the left, and further on again is his sheep shed. So he designed his batch footpath in a way that it will take the biggest number of sheep that will be in any of his pens inside in the shed. So this footpath will hold 30 to 35 ewes, and there will be no more than 30 to 35 ewes in any of the pens in his shed. So he can get through his full flock of ewes that are inside in the shed in about 5 or 6 fills of there's 6 pens actually in the shed. So about 6 fills of the footpath, and he's footpathed his entire flock during the housing period. Again, the fact that it's roofed, he won't be mixing up new zinc sulfate solution every time he footpaths them, because the rainwater is being kept off the footpath. So it stops it from diluting the solution. I know lambing is a little bit away, but I suppose maybe if there's little bits of tweaks and things to be made in the system, now is the time to be thinking about them. We're in the process of analysing the results of the Teagasc Sheep Labour Survey at the minute, but at a preliminary look at the results, when we looked around lambing facilities and that kind of thing, 43% of farms have a sink and hot water in their lambing area, so that means that 57% do not. 25% only have a piped water supply to the individual lambing pens, and up to 40% of people are bottle feeding the surplus lambs. So with that in mind, a couple of things maybe to consider as kind of relatively small investments that you could maybe put in place between now and lambing. A workstation is a really useful thing to have inside in your lambing area. It should provide storage for all your lambing kit and your essentials. And ideally you should include a sink with a hot and cold water supply. So these little under sink heaters can be purchased for somewhere in or around €200 or a bit either side of it. You'll probably obviously need somebody to give you a hand plumbing and wiring it and that kind of thing. But it's something that can be done. Really handy to have hot water for making up a bit of artificial colostrum, or sterilizing your lambing equipment, or even washing your hands as you go. Like it is really handy to have that hot water source in the lambing shed. I mentioned, I suppose, that there's only 25% of people provide a water source to individual pens, and we all know that, I suppose, the workload that goes with an individual pen. When you talk about, you've got to get them, bedded, you've got to get water into them, you've got to get meal into them, you've got to have a little hair rack, or to take a little bit of hair silage. So do take a lot of individual attention. So if you can take bucketing water into each pen out of the equation, it certainly is a labour saver around the lambing time. And you wasn't drinking about 10 litres of water a day shortly after lambing, so it is quite a bit of work to bucket that into individual pens. Self-filling drinkers, just as you can describe along here, this wall is a line of individual lambing pens, so you can see each pen has its own drinking bowl. Ideal setup, but it's probably a more expensive one to put in place. The 100 ml water pipe, that's this particular example here, it's plumbed, and there's a little ball cock at the end of it here. So there's, just can see there's little slots cut out, and this is the way it runs along the individual pens. There's a more there's a different version of it here. It's actually double line of pens where it's going up and down both sides. So it's just having a system that and there's a bung at the end of them here that can be opened and flushed out, cleaned out. You always have the habit of defecating into these pipes from time to time, so that can happen. And again, I suppose, look at the last option, rather than filling buckets from a tap, is that if you had a barrel in the corner of where your lambing pens are situated, if you had a barrel that's plumbed with a ball cock, so that there's always a barrel of water available to fill buckets from, I suppose is maybe another option. Maybe not as good as your pipe and thing, but at a minimum, if you had something like that in place, at least you have a ready bucket of water. Filling a bucket or filling a barrel of water from a tap while you're busy doing other things is not the best idea from experience, because it's a great way to flood your shed, because you'll surely forget to turn off the tap until you see water running out under your feet. Again, we mentioned earlier the high proportion of people that still bottle their surplus lambs. I'm not going to get into the artificial rearing system in any great detail, but only to say that it can be a fairly simple setup. A small pen, allowing about 0.6 of a metre squared per lamb. Some of your basic ab lib feeders, there's lots of them on the market, ideal for rearing 20 to 25 lambs. They just need a power source, and they'll keep you mix up milk once or twice a day, and they'll keep the milk warm. And it's only a matter of getting lambs trained into it. And when there's a few trained in, the rest of them will train in very quick. And again, for a modest enough cost, between 250 and up to €500, you can have a basic ad lib feeder that will cater for 20 to 25 lambs, no bother at all. You do, as part of the setup of the pen, you just need some way of providing them with a little bit of creep after a while to get them trained into eating a little bit of meal before they're weaned. There are obviously larger systems like this one here. An automated feeder that will cater for larger numbers. Again, roughly speaking, they can be in around $3,000 kind of a figure on either side of it. And this is just an example of a small area of lambs with access to a pre-feeder, and you can see that their teat is mounted on the gate here. So So a couple of other very quick ones to finish up with. Small little investments. A whiteboard is a very useful thing in a lambing shed. Just an example here of where you can do a plan of the the number of ewes in each pen and the rate of feeding they're on. So these are on 0.4 of a kg morning and evening, so on down along, particularly if you're getting somebody in to feed the lambs if you're away or anything like that. Also very useful around the lambing time, particularly if there's people doing different shifts in the lambing shed. You can put a few notes here that pen 2 has needs a cull tag, she's prolapsed, and pen 5 has weak lambs that were tubed at 6 this morning. Other handy little items, you very often pick up these kind of things in Aldi, or little boxes or tubs where you can have all your supplies as necessary, like for your lambing kit, or for your turning out. You can have your rubber rings and your applicator and your tagger and whatever else you might need. Some people use these type of buckets for the same purpose, but these small little hang-on feed buckets can be useful in pens for meal feeding, little things like that. And the other thing is very handy to have a few spare lambing gates, particularly late at night lambing. If there's a ewe lamb in a pen, and you can pull away 2 gates and just corner her into where she is, and she'll be fine for an hour or so until maybe you get some sleep or that, assuming everything is going well. But just can be handy to have a few gates like that, or if the lambing is particularly busy, that you can corner off and our lambs in a before they're moved to an individual pen. So I leave it at that, Ciaran. I suppose just the couple of things to complete any repairs or modifications as soon as you can. Be organised and kind of plan your daily routine with saving time in mind, and plan your little investments now, that the little tweaks you might put in place that'll be in place in good time before lambing. So thanks very
Perfect. Thanks, Damian. Good practical talk. Plenty to be considered on. And look, I think there's certainly aspects of that we could all implement. I might give you a break there for a moment. And thanks, you stop sharing there. Michael, I might get you just to come back on. Damian catch his breath. So we have a couple of questions in on the Q&A, and look, by all means, if anyone has any other questions, pop them in there now. Michael, look, we have a couple of questions around nutrition, and if you didn't mind me, I might just get you to share that traffic light slide again. That was one of the queries from that was coming in.
Okay, you tell me if you can see that.
They should be coming through there in a moment. Yeah, so that's coming in there. Look, so I suppose, Michael, like that's just a useful way of ranking the back of them ingredients you'll see in a bag. You're going to have a little bit of all of them. I suppose it's where it comes on. That is the important thing.
Yeah, so look at, I suppose most rations will probably have 10 or 15 ingredients in them. Generally when you get to the molasses, you're probably at 4 to 6%. So the ones below molasses are less than that. Generally, they're kind of, mostly minerals and calcium and, maybe a bit of salt and things like that. And, at the very top, you'll have the ones that are in there in the highest quantity. So really, we want to try and avoid some of the poor energy ones being in there at very high levels, because they just represent bad value for money, especially if you're paying a lot of money for the ration. A lot of these things would have very low energy values, quite, some of them as low and lower even than the hay and silage that you're feeding. So you don't want to be putting a whole pile of that into the sheep,
Yeah, no, good point. Look, we have a question here about from an organic farmer. If they're feeding a combi crop, barley, oats, and beans, just how would it kind of stack up in terms of feed? And I know you have some experience with that. And maybe at what point would you need to bring in extra protein for the like of that ration?
Yeah. So look at the combi crops. I suppose they represent probably a better feed value than some of the imported bagged rations that we see that have quite a lot of very low quality ingredients. A lot of them are based on lucerne and alfalfa, and have things like sunflower and oat feed and things like that in them. So generally a lot of the combi crops are kind of selling from probably 500 to 700 euros a ton, whereas those bagged rations are probably much more expensive. So I'm a fan of combi crops for that reason, for organic farmers, because I think generally if you look at the ingredients in a combi crop, they're all in the green box. I suppose the challenge is that with the combi crops, we generally don't know what's in it. Like how much peas, how much oats, how much barley, how much beans, how much wheat, and that's where the difficulty comes in. And especially in years where you get a real good crop of peas or beans, you could have very high quantities of peas and beans in it. Like we've seen combi crops now, for example, barley, oats, and peas with 40% peas. Now, in your wildest dreams as a nutritionist, you wouldn't consider putting 40% peas into a ration because of the kind of anti-nutritional factors associated with it. Like, so I suppose that's where maybe taking a protein sample from the, taking a representative sample of the product that you have bought, seeing what the protein comes out at, and then we have a reckoner that works out how much peas or beans is in that, and then maybe just topping it up with additional straight barley or oats or something like that to bring that to an acceptable level. And then I suppose in late pregnancy, so peas and beans are quite a good protein source. Probably not as high in this digestible undegradable protein DUP that we want. So there is organic soybean meal out there, and I think it's probably about looking for it in time, because a lot of the time I suppose it might be that simple to get. Your local co-op mightn't have it, and then bring in a bit of soybean meal for the ewes in the last 2 weeks. So I know that's probably not the answer that the person wants, but like it's such a variable crop, the combi crop, that it's really the point I'd be making. Find out how much protein is in it, take a sample, get it analyzed, a representative sample, then you use the Teagasc reckoner. So we have a reckoner there. Martin Burke, the organic tillage specialist, put together a reckoner, a ready reckoner, based on the protein percentage, what the estimated percentage of peas would be in it, and then you can kind of balance it with maybe it's fine as is, and maybe it's not, and you might benefit from adding in a bit of extra oats or barley or something like that just to balance it out, get them to eat it better. And then put in a little bit of soybean meal.
Okay. Look, I'm going to parse up two of the questions here. It's just in terms of, you mentioned that protein, feeding over conditioned ewes, and maybe a little bit of qualifier on that. Like, we can sometimes overestimate the condition of ewes, but when would you start introducing meal to them, or would you manage them anyway differently in late pregnancy?
Yeah. Okay. By and large, we very rarely see over conditioned ewes. So that's the first comment that you made there. Are they actually over conditioned? No. Look at Ciaran, yourself and myself were involved with a small flock of sheep on a very large dairy farm where they were really over conditioned a number of years ago, and they were having problems. But those are generally a rarity now. And the biggest problem with those over conditioned ewes is that they still need to be fed, because they're probably, if they're that over conditioned, not going to be able to mobilize, and they could have lots of other issues in terms of fatty liver and stuff like that. So look at, generally it's the one recommendation based on your silage quality. You start feeding 6, 8, 10 weeks out. From lambing, your tin singles go in with your twins to get extra feed. Your tin twin bearing ewes go in with your triplets. And that's the best way to manage it. And by and large, I would say the over-conditioned ewes, just you feed them as normal ewes, and that's it.
Generally not a big proportion flock. Look, I might just get you to briefly comment in terms of silage requirements, and some will be considering the budget. Maybe they went in a wee bit earlier this year, but take a typical 100 ewes. How much high quality silage would you need to feed them? And maybe just if you'd add a comment to that, like adjusting your concentrate amount to silage quality, that's another important thing to consider. You did mention forage testing there, so maybe just comment briefly on both of them.
Yeah. So look, I think Shane asked that question, and yeah, good question. So in general, ewes, I suppose, will eat, probably depending on how it's managed. But that high quality silage that you're talking about there, 73, 74, 75 DMD, probably about 1.6 kilos in the dry period, in the period before they start getting meal. Once you start upping the meal, and the amount of forage that they eat starts to reduce. So in general, there's about 200 kilograms in a well-filled bale. Your 750 kilo bale at 25% dry matter is probably coming out around just under 190 kilos of dry matter. So based on that kind of, and obviously it's an assumption, the size of your bale, the weight of the bale, the dry matter, all that type of thing comes into it. But let's just take that as being an average figure: 25% dry matter, 750 kilo bale. the answer to the question there would be for that particular flock, if you weren't feeding meal, so these are ewes in kind of coming into that late pregnancy period, but still on silage only, and it's being well managed, about 5.5 bales a week for those 100 ewes. So that's based on kind of 190 kilos of dry matter in a bale, and the ewe is eating about 1.6 kilos of dry matter between eating and utilizing, I suppose, including what you chuck out that they don't eat. So that's a general kind of a guideline. As you start feeding meal, then the amount of forage that they eat reduces. So in late pregnancy, what we see is that probably starting to drop down towards a kilo when they're on and maybe even a little bit less of dry matter as the ration goes up. Really important, that comment that you made there, Ciaran, and it's something that we saw in the Better Farm program as well, is that as the Better Farm participants started making better quality silage, they didn't cut back on the amount of meal that we're feeding. They were, traditionally used to whenever they'd start feeding meal, that's when they started and they fed the same amount. And we got very, very large lambs. We increased lamb live weight by about a kilo over and above what it should have been. We're basically overcooking the lambs by overfeeding the ewes. So really important, if you're making that really good quality silage, that 75 DMD plus silage, is that you then utilize that and you reduce the amount of meal that you're putting into the system because they don't need it. The reason for making the good quality silage is to save on the meal. So it's counterproductive if you then just go in and horse the meal into them anyway, and you end up with very large lambs and subsequent, more difficulties around lambing time.
Unconscious time, Mike, but just briefly on the nutrition one again. Look, you touched on those 10 ewes. We're better off intervening now and give a little bit of supplementation to try and hold condition there than trying to worry about them in late pregnancy. So I suppose tackle them now when they come in, or at least at scanning at the very latest.
Have to, yeah. Game is over if you wait until you're 5 or 6 weeks out from lambing. You're not going to do anything to them, and we would have seen that. Okay. There's quite a number of farmers that would have seen big losses in 24 and 23 because those seniors just were not able to rear their lambs when they went out.
Michael, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to come back to you in a moment. Damian, I've let you off lightly so far, so I have a couple of questions in for you. Look, I think on one of your slides there, you had sawdust in the pens, and the questions coming up around, would sawdust be a good base layer? Maybe just in broader terms about alternative beddings, the options.
Yeah, look, I see I've seen that question there. It probably is, just as the questioner describes, a good base layer, but it's not really a replacement for straw. There is a fair deal of absorbency in it. Probably some of the problem with using these type of materials in a base layer is that it's very slow to break down in terms of putting it out in your farmyard manure pile, and it's slow enough. But look, yes, it will be a help in terms of. But it would be just maybe used at the start to provide a bit of soakage for the first few rounds of bedding going in.
Okay. David, just in terms of ventilation, and look, you touched on some aspects of it. We still see some sheds with space sheeting on wet days, particularly the ones where after having, the shed can get wet. Could they be closed up? And maybe just in a broader terms, is there some simple things you touched on there, like, stepping out the side sheets and on the shed that can improve ventilation in them?
Yeah, look, as I say, the space sheeting, I suppose, was very reliant on the fact that if a shed is well filled with stock, be it cattle or sheep, that they're producing enough of heat, and the heat is rising, so that it's an outlet, I suppose. Really, is the space sheeting. It's an inlet, as you described, for rain as well. Unfortunately, I suppose, and it can particularly be an issue with sheep sheds, and particularly with straw bedded sheds. So, yeah, look, I mean. There are people have closed up space sheeted roofs and provided a canopy as an outlet, and just left a space with a canopy on top. Some people have space sheeted roofs, and they're quite happy with them. Maybe it's the fact that there's a high density of stock in the shed, and they're producing enough heat to keep it out. But as you say, look, there's simple things like, as you say, I'm talking about maybe a shed that doesn't have anything, I suppose, and that you're maybe raising a sheet here and there along the way to provide some bit of an outlet, or equally, as you describe, maybe raising a sheet along the side, or space sheeting the side of the shed in order to let in a bit of inlet air. But the principle is really that you need an inlet at the sides of the shed, and you need an outlet at somewhere in the roof. So whatever is the most practical way you can provide that, I suppose, is best. Like, yeah.
Look, it's some nice slides up there at the end. I was just thinking in terms of investments, and it's time of year normally we think about buying things. Yeah, some very basic things up on that we can sometimes overlook. The like of the whiteboard, the extra buckets, having maybe one of everything in the shed, even you show the buckets there for holding the lamb and supply kits. Those are the kind of things probably we don't think about until we need them. Somehow maybe going through it and just doing a quick shopping list. Well, here's a couple of things I could actually do
Yeah,
it and
yeah,
put them in.
and it's a good idea. Lots of people, lots of people have maybe have sheep in two or more sheds, like, and having your little kit, your lambing gloves, your lubricant, your iodine, these little
Yeah.
bits and pieces, your lambing aids, all of those things that you need. Having a couple of sets of them around the place, is always useful, and a bit like the man with a bit like the man with a place for everything and everything in its place, having a designated area to leave them in each shed, that you're not running around looking for them when you're
Yeah.
tired
Yeah, well,
in the night.
I was thinking that when you put up your work practice size, we're often guilty of doing things the way we always did them, as opposed to maybe thinking, could we leave this a bit simpler and not be walking around the place?
Yeah.
No, useful. Michael, I'll just bring you back. Look, we have a couple of questions up around lameness, and we're talking about reducing labour day with Damian. It's one thing that will cause a lot of labour during the winter. You've touched on a few bits, but I suppose one of the questions came up at the beginning of that. Should we be considering kind of culling more, whether it be in the rams or buying in, or maybe culling them repeat offenders? And maybe
Yeah.
just in that, like, look at the impact. I know you threw up some of the impacts of it, like even from lamb losses right the way to just poor performance. It has a big knock-on impact afterwards if you don't deal with it.
Yeah, look, at no different to if we could get rid of the rain. Sometimes in Ireland, it'd be a great country. If we had sheep that didn't go lame, it would be a great job. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So definitely culling is an option for culling repeat offenders is a good idea. But that only works if you get to a low level. If 40% of your sheep are lame, you cannot, and 20% of those end up, or 50% of those end up being repeat offenders. You can't cull 20% of the flock just because they're lame. By and large, people wouldn't have enough replacements. So the key thing, I suppose, first of all, is to get on top of it. And the only way really, I suppose, that we can get on top of it is effectively, and from a labor effectiveness point of view, is with a batch foot bat. So that's the first step. Once you get on top of it, and you get that incidence of lameness below 5%, then all those other options really come to fore. Culling those repeat offenders. You're talking about small numbers of sheep, and that's where you really get going. And we would have seen flocks where they would have done that, and they would have brought it further down to maybe less than 2%. So that's 2 in every 100 sheep being lame, and that's a low incidence, I suppose. But the critical thing, by and large, and we've seen this time and time on farms where people are struggling with lameness. Once they put in that batch foot bat, it really reduces the amount of labor associated with treating lame sheep, because every time the sheep are in the yard, they're going out through that footpath, and that's the critical thing. If we're absolutely convinced that most lameness starts with a scald, and scalds are easy to treat. The reasons why it progresses to a foot rot or subsequently to CODD, if that's on the farm, is because the scald hasn't been treated. And generally, the reason why the scald isn't treated is because we don't have a facility to do that easily. So that's, I suppose, the starting point. And then if you get it to a low level, then you consider that 2 strikes and she's out, or 3 strikes and she's out system. Yeah.
And like, look at the impact, I suppose, going forward, Michael. We see more prolapse at lame ewes, more tin ewes, lame ewes. Really enough that we maybe see lamb losses in that case, but you have all that other poor performance that'll come with it.
Absolutely. Look, and tin ewes are probably your shy feeders, and they're the ones that are most likely to get twin lamb disease or milk fever and all those issues, in particular if they're carrying high litter size. And if you think about it, no different to what Damian was talking about, most of the work on the farm is associated with that small number of sheep that are creating problems for you. You know, the ewe that lambs down isn't lame, goes out with her 2 lambs, does a good job on the 2 lambs and brings them in at weaning time. You know, there's not much work with her. It's the one that you're running around after, catching her, treating her. You know, she's not taking a lamb, bring her back in, you know, bottle feeding a lamb for a bit, see will he get going, no, take the lamb off her. They're the ones where we have the trouble, you know, or the ewe that's in and down inside in the pen for a couple of days because she got a touch of milk fever or twin lamb disease. Like, that's where the workload is associated. So the more we can avoid those things, the easier we make life for ourselves.
Okay. Gentlemen, I think you must have done very well on your end because we're going over the time and there's been plenty of questions. I maybe fell down on my side not keeping you to time, but we are going well over the hour at this stage. Look, we're going to wrap it up for tonight. I'd like to thank both of you for coming on. I think to take something important from it, from both of you, that bit of planning at the moment is key, and that bit of attention to detail in mid-pregnancy can have a big impact on our subsequent outcomes next spring. So look, thank you both for 2 very interesting talks. The webinar is being recorded tonight, so we'll have it up on our Teagasc YouTube channel in the coming days. We're going to be back with you on the 14th of January, where we're going to focus on flock health. So again, that'll be circulated to anybody who has registered, and it'll be running at 8 o'clock on the 14th. So we'll cover that topic again, very relevant at that time of year. So look, for tonight, thanks everybody who attended, for those that asked questions, and again, mostly thanks to Michael and Damian for coming on and giving 2 very interesting talks. So we'll leave it at that. Thanks everybody, and
Thanks,
we'll
everybody.
see you again.
Okay, take care.
Bye now.